Good afternoon. Thank you, Rod. First, I want to say I am not Bruce Condon, interim provost. I am Deborah Sequeira, Dean of Arts and Humanities at Seattle Pacific, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 28th annual C. May Marston Lecture. This afternoon, we remember a woman associated with this university almost from its inception and certainly through the first half of its history. So we're gathering to honor the memory of Professor C. May Marston, who was known as a legend in her own time. Born in 1877, she attended high school in Alexander Hall when we were at Seattle Seminary and graduated in 1898, just 7 years after our founding. She earned a bachelor's degree from our sister school, Greenville College in Illinois, and a master's degree from the University of Washington. Professor Marston then joined the faculty at newly renamed Seattle Pacific College in 1902. She taught Latin, Greek, English, French, and German for 56 years. Would you let that sink in? 56 years. In 1952, still before I was born, she received an honorary doctorate. The citation at that conferral of that degree read in part, "We honor you as a teacher who has won your way into the hearts and lives of hundreds of young people. We honor you as a colleague, one who understands, one who's loyal and dependable. We honor you because of your sympathetic understanding and the modest yet effective manner in which you have insisted upon adhering to high standards. We honor you for what you have meant to Seattle Pacific College through your multiplied gifts. But we honor you most because of your fine Christian spirit, your exemplary life, your devotion to Christian education, and to Jesus Christ." The endowment supporting this lecture was given by Dr. Marston's longtime friend, Dr. Winifred Weeder, and she was a legend in her own time as well, and I do remember Dr. Weeder, so I am that old, sort of. Personally, I'm extraordinarily grateful for the contribution of these renowned women, our matriarchs, to the legacy of SPU, and we need to celebrate them far more often. I'm also grateful for our colleague, Dr. Owen Ewald, who holds the C. May Marston Professorship of Classics, and he also resides in Marston Hall, so. But the jury's still out whether Dr. Ewald could match Professor Marston's 56 years of service.
Thank you, Deborah. I recently heard a great anecdote about Dr. Marston from Emeritus Professor Dr. Wes Lindgren. He told me that in the depths of the Depression, when Seattle Pacific College was struggling financially, President C. Hoyt Watson borrowed $500 from Dr. Marston to make expenses meet during the summer when enrollments were low. She drove a solid bargain, somewhere between 5 to 7% per annum. Watson paid her back in full. Allow me to introduce Dr. Owen Ewald, our C. May Marston professor. Dr. Ewald is an associate professor of classics at SPU. Over the past 19 years, he's taught Latin, Greek, ancient literature and translation, art history, and ancient history. He has taught in the U Scholars Program. Any honors students here today? Since 2008, the languages he can read include ancient Greek, Latin, French, German, Italian, Sanskrit, and English.
His English is a little spotty.
His scholarship includes articles on aesthetics, historiography, poetics, and topography, as well as translations. His most recent scholarly work in preparation that I found on his CV is entitled "Pearls, Not Worms: A Case of Interfaith Literary Curation." I really want to know more about that. And today we have the chance to hear Dr. Ewald speak on world domination and universal history. I know we're in for a treat. Dr. Ewald?
Thanks to Dean Sakara, to Assistant Provost Margaret Brown and her staff, Jen Wilson and Annie Kilpatrick. Thanks also to ETM for filming this event and for upload to YouTube. And thank you all for coming. Next, I need to define some terms and what I don't mean. The first part of my title, World Domination, has become a joke as a goal for cartoon villains, especially because of a series called Pinky and the Brain, which those of a certain age will remember. If that does not work for you, I offer here Jim Carrey as Dr. Robotnik, the villain of the forthcoming Sonic the Hedgehog movie. His goal is not just world domination, but full world domination. I use the term universal, not strictly in the astronomical sense, but as referring to the whole, at least the whole as it is known or thought about from a particular cultural standpoint. For example, for the ancient Greeks, the whole includes Bactria or Afghanistan, but not China. But for the ancient Chinese, the whole includes Bactria or Afghanistan, but not Greece. But as we shall see, even histories of the whole can often include nature, plants, rivers, or astronomy. History can have the simple meaning of what happened, but hardly anyone tries to include absolutely everything, from the Great Flood to the most recent emperor of Rome. Instead, there's a selection process from all the things to yield the right level and type of coverage, to put events into a framework that makes sense, and to avoid an information cascade of one darn thing after another. But I hope to show that in the long run, the composition of universal history evolves in response to attempts to take over the world. Universal history as a response to world domination makes a certain amount of sense. Once you have the category world, logical questions to ask are, what does the world consist of, and how did it get that way? Peoples of the book might go to the Hebrew Bible for God's creation, a physical reality, and the human beings who inhabit it. But note that the oral traditions of the Hebrew Bible were formed in response to a series of expansionist empires, first New Kingdom Egypt and the Hittites of Anatolia/Turkey, both of which attempted to control Syria and Palestine, and next Neo-Assyria and Persia, which wanted to control everything from Bactria through Egypt. The Hebrew Bible is not glorifying these world empires, but constructing an alternative narrative of God acting in nature and in all of human history. For example, one of many Egyptian creation narratives involves a beetle rolling a ball of dung up a hill to create the sun rising out of the water of the Nile River. The Nile River was both monitored and to some extent controlled by the pharaoh, their emperor. In contrast, a creation narrative in the Hebrew Bible features a garden with its own water sources, 4 rivers flowing in different directions as part of God's provision for humanity. A river watering the garden flowed from Eden. From there it was separated into 4 headwaters. The name of the first is the Pishon. It winds through the entire land of Havilah where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. Aromatic resin and onyx are also there. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It winds through the entire land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris. It runs along the east side of Ashur, Assyria. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. The part I want to highlight here is that the Gihon is the Nile River, and this text does not actually mention Egypt, which is downstream, but Cush, which is upstream, an ancient name for Ethiopia. Neo-Assyria, based in North Iraq, tried to take over the world under the pretext that their city god, Ashur, ordered them to, and at one point their empire stretched deep into Egypt. In this relief from Nimrod, Assyrian soldiers are climbing a siege ladder to conquer a city. But as a critique, the Hebrew prophet Isaiah says, the nations are like a drop in a bucket. They are regarded as dust on the scales. He weighs the islands as though they were fine dust. Before him, all the nations are as nothing. They are regarded by him as worthless and less than nothing. Here the divine frame makes everything else small. Some biblical texts see Assyria as God's way of punishing the northern kingdom of Israel for worshiping foreign gods, but Assyria's success occurs only because the one true God allows it. Moreover, the Hebrew Bible continued to be developed during the Persian Empire, which stretched from Bactria through Anatolia and into Egypt. It was the first empire that bragged that the sun never set on it, but far from the last. Although the Persians allowed the Jews to return from the Babylonian captivity and rebuild the temple at Jerusalem, the Jews never acknowledged the Persian Empire as bigger than God. In particular, the book of Daniel is not only a response to Persian imperial ambitions, but also a wider angle view of human history. This is not simply the idea that my God is bigger than your God, but that only God's kingdom can fill the earth and replace other kingdoms. Daniel says, "In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever." Again, God puts the frame around everything with his eternal kingdom. I'm not arguing that the Hebrew Bible is the first work of universal history, but it offers a counterview to a lot of attempts at world domination. Rather, the first universal history close to our modern sense of the term belongs to a Greek author, Ephorus, whom I will discuss soon. Later, after 350 BC, the Macedonian rulers Philip II and his son Alexander III, better known as the Great, tried to take over the world, including most of the lands ruled by the Persian Empire. Alexander the Great really did aim at world domination and multiplied his territorial inheritance tenfold by conquering all the way to India. Interestingly, the response to Alexander the Great from India is not to develop universal history, but to develop its own tradition of epic poetry about local heroes, and to start the new genre of philosophical dialogue, or Upanishad. Richard Solomon, a scholar of Indian Buddhism, told me that the most common response to Alexander in Indian literature was not to mention him at all. Back in Greece, the Greek historian Ephorus developed universal history as a distinct prose genre as a response to Alexander. The later prose historian Polybius claims that Ephorus was the first and only historian resolved to write universal history. The history begins with the descendants of Heracles in 1090 BC, a common ancestor or culture hero for many of the Greeks, and ends with Philip II's capture of the Greek city of Perinthus in 340 BC. But Perinthus is not the climax of Greek history, rather it's within a larger frame. Ephorus also had a map of his whole world that had Indians to the east, Celts to the west, Scythians to the north, and Ethiopians to the south. And his map had south at the top rather than north. Meanwhile, his rectangular world featured in its corners the winter sunrise at top right, winter sunset at bottom left. At top left, winter sunrise, top right, winter sunset, bottom left, summer sunrise, and at bottom right, summer sunset to keep the compass directions straight. This may seem to us rather reductive. All of sub-Saharan Africa is Ethiopians, Celts is all the non-Greeks in Europe, but these peoples are significant because their homelands lay outside the Macedonian Empire at its greatest extent, and the Macedonian Empire is the donut hole in the middle of the map. Ephorus does write about the Macedonian Empire, but his overall frame is much larger. Another Ephorus quote deals with the history of Greek military tactics in southern Greek cities. Quote, "The Mantineans and the Arcadians were devoted to the arts of war, and even today people refer to war gear and the ancient style of armor as Mantinean on the ground that they invented them. In addition, lessons in hoplite fighting were first invented in Mantinea, and the art was taught by Demmius." What does this have to do with the Macedonian Empire? Alexander the Great was known as a military innovator, combining the Theban-style phalanx with coordinated cavalry attacks. So for Ephorus to stress previous military innovation seems to show either that Alexander drew on previous innovators, or that someone else could come along and invent something superior to Alexander's equipment and tactics. Ephorus is right to take the long view. After Ephorus died, the Roman maniple outmaneuvered the Macedonian phalanx. Moreover, Ephorus at times adopts a frame even larger than Earth, astronomy. Because of a lot of Ephorus's work has not survived, we mainly know about Ephorus's use of astronomy because the Roman philosopher Seneca thinks he was wrong. Seneca comments that the disintegration of a comet in 373 to 372 BC is not recorded by anybody but Ephorus. He says, quote, "But Ephorus is not worthy of the most scrupulous trust. He often is deceived, he often deceives. Just as he treated this comet, which was watched over by the eyes of all mortals as an event of great significance when it has blotted out Helike, that's the Big Dipper, and Buris by its own rising. He says that it split into two parts, which no one besides himself has recorded. But whether this event happened or not, It is noteworthy that Epirus finds a larger frame than an earthly empire aiming at world domination, rather an event visible from large parts of the world. The next empire that arises is Rome, which expanded to take over much of the Mediterranean basin by 44 BC. You'll recognize many of the modern nations, Spain, parts of Syria, parts of Egypt, parts of the Balkans, but many of them are around the sea. Okay. Polybius, another Greek historian, came along about 150 years later than Epirus. He came from a place called Megalopolis, which means large city in Greek, but it was actually well under 30,000 people. Polybius is primarily concerned with the Roman rise to power and the political institutions that helped Rome become a world power. In his own words, Polybius writes, "I undertook to make a fresh beginning from this date, the 139th Olympiad, and henceforth to deal with the general history of the whole world, classing it under Olympiads, dividing those into years and placing contemporary events side by side for comparison until the capture of Carthage, the battle of the Achaeans and Romans at the Isthmus, that is at Corinth in 146 BC, and the consequent settlement, that is a political arrangement, of Greece. As I said, students by this treatment will attain the best and most salutary result, which is to know how and by what system of polity the whole world was subjected to Rome, an event without any parallel in the past," end quote. Note that Polybius attributes Rome's success to its polity or government, and he feels that this has greater explanatory power than mere calculations of military resources or arguments about who's more virtuous. Not coincidentally, Polybius is heavily involved in post-Roman Greek politics and helps persuade Greek cities to accept Roman rule and government. Towards the end of his history, Polybius describes the outbreak of the Achaean War in 146 BC. Resistance to Rome and quarrels with fellow Greeks led to the Achaean defeat. In other words, because of bad government and bad behavior. Polybius writes, quote, "When upon reaching the Peloponnesus, they," that is Sextus Julius Caesar and his fellow Romans, "conversed with the Achaeans, that is Greeks, in Aegium. Their language was most courteous. They scarcely alluded to the charge of ill-treating the legates or demanded any justification of the conduct of the Achaeans, but taking a more favorable view of what had occurred than the Achaeans themselves, begged them not to give any further offense either to the Romans or to the Lacedaemonians, that is the Spartans. Upon this, all the wiser people gladly accepted the advice and paid great heed to it, conscious as they were of their error and having before their eyes the fate that awaited those who opposed Rome. But the majority, while having nothing to say against the just strictures of Sextus and being obliged to keep silence, yet remained ill-conditioned and demoralized." Okay. These grumpy Achaeans revolt despite Roman diplomacy, and the Romans promptly destroy their headquarters, the port city of Corinth, as Polybius knew. Polybius did not live to see how Gaius Julius Caesar, a relative of Sextus Julius Caesar, later tried to rebuild the city of Corinth and even planned a canal to let ships avoid sailing around the peninsula of southern Greece, of the Peloponnese. And this canal was only finished by the modern nation-state of Greece. But Polybius knew that Rome was expanding into Greece permanently and advised cooperation rather than resistance. The Greek historian Posidonius of Apamea, from what's now Turkey, explains the domination of Rome, although he focuses on the period after 146 BC, just where Polybius left off, and ends with 88 BC. His history runs almost one book per year and has broad coverage rather than reaching for a long expanse of time. He's not only an historian, but also a Stoic philosopher who advocates self-control to conform with nature. For example, he describes the Celts, living in what's now France, as dining in accordance with nature, with plenty of food, but no luxurious accessories. This may be an implicit criticism of Roman luxury, but not necessarily of Roman control. He writes, "The Celts place hay on the ground when they serve their meals, which they take on wooden tables raised only slightly from the ground. Their food consists of a few loaves of bread, but of large quantities of meat prepared in water or roasted over coals or on spits. They eat this in a clean way, but like lions, since they take whole joints with both hands and bite them off at the bones. If any piece proves hard to tear away, they slice it off with a small knife, which lies at hand in its sheath in a special box." This is not simply ethnography, but offering a way to pare down your dining habits in accordance with nature. Posidonius asks, what's the minimum amount of equipment you need to eat at a feast? But among other peoples, he found negative examples of conformity to nature or of self-control, such as the Greek ruler of Egypt, Ptolemy VII Euergetes. He writes, but the dynasty of Egypt, hated by the mobs, but being flattered by his courtiers and living in great luxury, could not walk unless he was traveling while leaning on 2 servants. But leaping down barefoot from the lofty dining couches into the dances and drinking parties, he used to perform more intense dances than those who had trained. Okay. The point here is not that the Greeks in Egypt were morally depraved, but that their leadership cared more about dancing than governing, more about indulgence than about self-control. The Romans easily brought Egypt into their political orbit, even though Egypt was still technically a separate government when Posidonius died around 51 BC. In both these anecdotes, the modest barbarians and the over-the-top ruler, Posidonius wants to show his readers, including Romans, examples to imitate and to avoid. Posidonius not only discusses human events and motivations, but also forces of nature, such as tides and the sun. Posidonius even uses the distances between the cities of Rhodes and Alexandria and the difference in the angle of the star Canopus observed on the same day from both places to calculate the size of the Earth. That's what this diagram behind me shows. He actually has the wrong distance and the wrong angle, but the errors fall in the same direction. So his estimates actually, let's say, within 3%, and it's a little too large rather than a little too small. Posidonius also attempts to measure the moon and the sun, but is much less successful because of his wrong assumptions. He believes, for example, that the moon has a cylindrical rather than a conical shadow. But having experienced the eclipse, we know that's fake. Okay. But because of his contributions to astronomy, Posidonius has a crater of the moon named for him, also shown here. Posidonius taught the future Roman political leader Cicero, and Cicero explored Stoic cosmology in a work called The Dream of Scipio, written around 51 BC. In the dream, Scipio sees the Earth from space, as shown to him by his ancestor, also named Scipio. Scipio the elder says, quote, "For what renown among men or what glory worth the seeking can you acquire? You see that on the earth only scattered and narrow plots are inhabited, while even in the very patches, as it were, in which men dwell, vast deserts are interspersed." So even in the image behind me, showing Western Europe from space, okay, even with electric lights, you can see how much space there is between human habitation, even now. Cicero is a powerful Roman, but he has learned from the Greek philosopher Posidonius how small Roman efforts at world domination actually were. Now I want to go to the other end of the globe, to Han Dynasty China. Sima Qian wrote records of the Grand Historian, or Shiji, finished around 94 BC. In other words, he's a contemporary of Posidonius, with a similarly broad range of subjects and 500,000 characters of text. One chapter even discusses the development of astronomy. Sima Qian had an official position of Grand Historian or Grand Scribe, and this gave him access to lots of records and documents and freedom to travel throughout China for research. In his time, Han Dynasty China was also trying for world domination, and his emperor, the Emperor Wu, was one of the most expansionist emperors in Chinese history, particularly towards the west. He aimed at Central Asia, which included a place called Taxia, otherwise known as Bactria, or Afghanistan. Sima Qian criticizes Emperor Wu for pursuing disastrous campaigns against nomads known as the Xiongnu, rather than protecting the center of the empire. In Sima Qian's own time, the general Li Ling carried out an unsuccessful campaign against the Xiongnu in 101 BC, and the Emperor Wu executed the general's entire family, including him. Sima Qian tried to advise the emperor instead to define and demote the general, but the emperor castrated Sima Qian and put him in jail for a year. Sima Qian felt that Wu did not sufficiently think through his campaigns in Central Asia, and Sima Qian reports at third hand a previous recommendation not to campaign in this area, not to campaign against the Xiongnu in northwest China. So Sima Qian quotes Chu Fuyan, quoting the advice of Li Shu, who died in 208 BC. He says, "The Shenu have no residence, surrounded by inner and outer walls, no protection of accumulated grains, move around as birds flit about, and they would be difficult to obtain and to control. If we send lightly equipped troops into their territory, their lines of provisions would certainly be used up. If they move with wagons of provisions following them, the provisions will be too heavy and not keep up with the task. Even if we win their territory, it is not enough to be profitable. Even if we encounter their people, we cannot have them serve us or us govern them. In victory, we would have to kill them, and this is not acting as mother and father of the people as the emperor should. To make the central states wasted and exhausted, and to make the Shenu content, this is not a good strategy." End quote. In other words, there's nothing to win and no way to win it. But this advice is located over 100 years in the past to minimize political risk to the writer, and the long-dead courtiers are safe from the emperor's anger. The themes of envy and betrayal run through the many chapters of Sima Qian, even in something as positive as medicine and healing. Memoir 45 discusses two legendary doctors, Bian Chuye and Sang Ka. Bian Chuye allegedly could diagnose any illness just by taking someone's pulse. He knew how to fix yin-yang imbalances, and he could pick up new medical specialties as needed. Sima Qian writes, quote, "The legendary doctor Bian Chuye's name was known throughout the world. When he came into Shanyang, he heard that the people of Qin admired children, and he then became a children's physician. He transformed himself according to local customs. Li Shi, the Grand Prefect of Medicine in Qin, knew himself that his techniques for healing were not as good as Bian Chuye's, so he sent someone to assassinate him." Yeah. Again, note the motif of envy or hatred, even towards someone who heals sick children. Similarly, other parts of the work seem to be intended as unfavorable contrast to the emperor or his court. For example, the biographies of 5 assassins in chapter 86 portray these assassins as more worthy of admiration than the emperor's courtier or the emperor himself. One final note is that Sima Qian is a rich source for wuxia literature, a Chinese genre of historical novel and film. If you've seen Ang Lee's film, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, you are acquainted with this genre. My next historian is Josephus, who writes in Greek under the Roman Empire about the history of his own Jewish people. In other words, he brings together a lot of the previous threads. He lost a war against Rome in Palestine, the first Jewish war in 66 to 73 AD, and he was captured and brought to Rome himself to serve as an imperial advisor. He used Greek historians, but in a way that critiques them for their discussion of non-Greek ethnic groups like the Jews. He writes, quote, "For the proof of historical veracity is universal agreement in the description, oral or written, of the same events. On the contrary, each of these writers, in giving his divergent account of the same incidents, hope thereby to be thought the most veracious of all. While then for eloquence and literary ability we must yield the palm to the Greek historians, we have no reason to do so for veracity in the history of antiquity, least of all where the particular history of each separate foreign nation is concerned." In other words, Josephus uses the Greek historians as a model for his own prose, but he regards the Hebrew Bible as a reliable historical source going back to the very beginning. Remember the 4 rivers of Eden? Here's Josephus' version with updates for his own context. "Now this garden is watered by a single river whose stream encircles all the earth and is parted into 4 branches. Of these, Physon, the name means multitude, runs towards India and falls into the sea, being called by the Greeks Ganges. Euphrates and Tigris end in the Erythraean Sea, that's the Persian Gulf. The Euphrates is called Phoros, signifying either dispersion or flower, and the Tigris is Diglath, expressing at once narrowness and rapidity. Lastly, Gaon, which flows through Egypt, means that which wells up to us from the opposite world, and by Greeks is called the Nile." Even though Josephus went to Rome as a prisoner of war and advisor to the Flavian emperors, he does not mention the Tiber or the Danube. Rather, the center of his world is Jerusalem, where he was born. Unlike the Hebrew Bible, he includes Egypt, but now it's firmly a Roman province under the emperor's control. Josephus repeatedly emphasizes how the Jewish people develop institutions and customs of their own, in parallel to the different world empires. Here's Josephus' account of Moses' sister Miriam, famous for celebrating the demise of the Pharaonic army pursuing the exodus of the Israelites. For contrast, the Septuagint says only, she died there and was buried there. But Josephus expands it considerably. He writes, At that time, the end of life overtook his sister Mariame, who had completed her 40th year since she had left Egypt, on the new moon of the month of Xanthicus, the moon of March, according to the moon. They buried her lavishly at public expense on a certain mountain that they call Sin. And Moses, that is Moses, purified the people after they had mourned for 30 days in this manner. Note the prominence of the Exodus as a central event, not only in the Hebrew Bible, but also in Josephus, as part of resistance to the Egyptian Empire. In my reading of history, the Exodus coincides with the beginning of the New Kingdom, Egypt's most expansionist period. But Josephus also turns Miriam's death into an occasion to show her honor, with an elaborate burial and 30 days of mourning. Some Greek cities, including Athens, had laws limiting mourning to 30 days, so some pagan readers would recognize that Miriam's funeral, and therefore her honor, hit the legal maximum. Looking through a Roman lens, burial at public expense for a woman was the sort of honor only given to a woman of very high status. We know, in fact, about one such funeral for Atia, mother of the Emperor Augustus. The Christian historian Eusebius, who respected Josephus a great deal, is famous for two historical works, the Chronicon and the Ecclesiastical or Church History. The Chronicon tries to synchronize years of several different civilizations, but it's mainly known to us through Jerome's Latin translation and through the Armenian translation shown here. The first book of the Chronicon was organized by 5 regions, each with its own year-counting system. The Near Eastern empires, from the Babylonians or the Chaldeans onward, the Hebrews, from Adam to the destruction of the Second Temple, Egyptians from the Old Kingdom to the end of the Ptolemies, Greeks, including the Macedonian Empire, and finally the Romans, who eventually become the only region. The second book lays out chronological data in a table of 3 or more columns, shown here. Again, note the events on the sides and the year-counting systems in the central column. He leaves out Goths, Ethiopians, Indians, Persians, and Chinese, with the mistaken idea that all these are subject to Rome. The idea is based on propaganda dating from the time of the Emperor Augustus, where he mislabels trade as tribute. We're still unclear on Eusebius' sources for this work, since nothing like it had ever been attempted before, but we'll see a similar event in the 1800s AD. Eusebius' ecclesiastical history, that is history of the church, had 2 goals: to continue the history of the church after Acts, and to deal with the persecution of Christianity under the Roman Empire from the Christian point of view. My first example discusses what happened to St. Mark after writing the Gospel, plus the growth of Christianity in Egypt. Nevertheless, Eusebius seems to have used some lost Christian sources, indicated by the introductory words, "they say." They say that this Mark was the first to be sent to preach in Egypt the gospel which he had also put into writing, and was the first to establish churches in Alexandria, that is, of Egypt itself. The number of men and women who were there converted at the first attempt was so great, and their asceticism was so extraordinarily philosophic, that is, Christian, that Philo thought it right to describe their conduct in assemblies and meals and all the rest of their manner of life. In Eusebius' account, Christianity is becoming enculturated within a Greek-speaking Egyptian context, based in the city of Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great. Also note the use of a Jewish source, Philo, whose goal was to reconcile Judaism and Greek philosophy. Philo also became a model for early Christians to use philosophy and to interpret texts in allegorical ways. But Eusebius' context also included the Great Persecution, 303 to 311 AD, an attempt to exterminate Christianity, especially in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. The empire was becoming even more totalitarian, not merely ensuring military loyalty or imposing price controls, but also trying to kill off Christians and burn their sacred books. This persecution motivated Constantine, the son of the Western Caesar, and the Western Caesar is a kind of assistant emperor. It motivated Constantine to become supreme emperor and to bring the persecution to an end. This persecution also motivated Eusebius to write his history of the Christian church and to write a flattering biography of Constantine. Even his regular church history features praise of Constantine by way of his father, Constantius Chlorus. as follows. Chlorus was indeed the only one of our contemporaries who passed the whole period of his reign in a manner worthy of his high office, and in other respects displayed himself in a most favorable and beneficent light toward all. He took no part in the war against us Christians, but even preserved the God-fearing persons among his subjects from injury and harsh treatment. Also, he did not pull down church buildings, nor employ any other new device against us. His son Constantine, from the very first, was proclaimed by armies most perfect emperor, and earlier, by God himself, the King Supreme. He took as his example his father's piety toward our doctrine. Of course, this is panegyric, that is, on the rhetoric of praise, but note how much of it is negative praise, depending on the fact that Chlorus is not persecuting the church. He took no part in the war against us Christians, okay, rather than any examples of good behavior that are specifically linked to Christian practices. He does not build churches, as his son Constantine did, but merely refrains from demolishing them. Just so I do not lose sight of the theme of world domination, Eusebius sees domination of the Roman Empire by totalitarian pagans as bad, but domination by tolerant Christians as good. And for Eusebius, the Roman Empire is basically the world. In Eusebius' account, Constantine's early actions focus on religious freedom, like the Edict of Toleration, granting free choice of worship to all inhabitants of the Roman Empire, and hence to the world. Crossing over to histories written in Latin, I bring up Orosius, who considered himself a follower of Eusebius, but he hailed from Braga in Spain, at the other end of the Roman Empire. He wrote in 7 short books a history of the world from creation to his own time, summarizing earlier historians, including several of the ones that we've mentioned, such as Polybius. But there's a special place for the Bible among his sources, and in the following passage, Orosius refers to the Bible as, quote, the most reliable authors. Note that the ark mentioned here is Noah's Ark. The most reliable authors very clearly state that the sea was poured over all the land and a deluge unleashed it, so that the world became entirely sea or sky, and that the human race was entirely destroyed, save for a few kept safe in the ark as a reward for their faith and in order to create a new race. Even those who know nothing of times gone by or of the author of those times have borne witness that this was so, learning of it by putting together the evidence and hints given by stones, which we see on far-flung mountains, encrusted with sea and oyster shells, and which often show signs of being hollowed out by the waves. Now, although I could produce more compelling proofs of this sort which are worth relating, let these 2 principal points be sufficient, namely that concerning the fall of the first man and the condemnation of his offspring in life, and that concerning the damnation of the entire human race which followed from it. Notice the evidences that he brings up for a world flood, and the feature of seashells in the mountain was noticed by the Roman poet Ovid and by Chinese sources. Towards the end, Orosius emphasizes a theology of history, the theme of human fall and divine punishment. Near the end of Book 6, Orosius makes the odd claim that Christ was a Roman citizen, which changes God's chosen people from the Jews to the Romans. He writes, "Our Lord Jesus Christ brought to the apogee of power this city, Rome, which had grown and been defended by his will, vehemently wishing to belong to it when he came, and to be called a Roman citizen by the decree of the Roman census." Of course, Jesus was not legally a Roman citizen, because citizenship had not yet been extended to all freeborn inhabitants of the empire. Also, and this is not trivial, the Roman Empire later put Jesus to death and persecuted his followers. Okay. But the fact that Jesus was born within the empire is thought to explain why Christianity expanded there. The ideas of divine punishment in Rome as the chosen people especially bear fruit in Orosius' discussions of the 3 burnings of Rome, the first by the Gauls in 390 BC, the second by Nero in 64 AD, and the third by Alaric, king of the Goths, in 410 AD. During the first burning, there was no Christianity to mitigate suffering. Nero blamed the second fire on the Christians and used it as an excuse to burn them alive. In the third burning, the Roman Empire is majority Christian, but still far from morally perfect and in need of punishments for its sins. Indeed, being the chosen people does not exempt you from consequences. Orosius says about this fire, quote, "On the 3rd day, after the barbarians had entered the city, they departed of their own free will. A number of buildings had been set alight, but not on the scale of the disaster that had occurred in the 700th year from the city's foundation." That's the Nero Fire. For if I were to recall the fire that the Romans' own emperor Nero brought about for his own amusement, it would be beyond doubt that the second fire, started by an emperor's dissipation, could not be likened to this one, brought on by the victor's wrath. Nor ought I to recall the Gauls' sack of Rome as something similar. They held Rome, treading on the ashes of the burnt ruined city for almost a year. And so that no one should doubt that the enemy was allowed to do this, in order to punish the arrogant, debauched blasphemy of the town, at the same time, the most famous buildings in the city, which the enemy was unable to set alight, were destroyed by lightning. Again, Orosius makes the event an example of divine punishment for fallen humanity. The Goths are God's agent to punish Rome, and lightning comes from heaven to complete the punishment. Orosius then reacts to two different attempts at world domination, the first being the Roman Empire, the second being the Goths, who would eventually conquer areas as far west as Spain, although they did not consider themselves one united group or nation. Note that this explanation of the 410 AD fire was not the only Christian view. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, explains in his work The City of God that the burning of Rome was an example of the transience of earthly cities as opposed to the permanence of the heavenly Jerusalem, our true home, the city of God. But his work's more theology than history. Many Christian historians and theologians followed Orosius, and I want to skip over most of the Middle Ages with the help of a quote from a Cistercian monk and bishop, Otto von Freising. Otto von Freising wrote the Chronica de Duabus Civitatibus, or Chronicles of the Two Cities, starting around 1143 AD. The two cities of Jerusalem and Babel, the city of God and the city of man, kind of along Augustinian lines. Otto von Freising describes his task as easier after the reign of the Christian emperor Theodosius in 395 AD. Quote, since not only all the people, but also the emperors, except a few, were Orthodox Catholics, I seem to myself to have composed a history, not of two cities, but virtually of one body, which I call the Church. The identification of history with the Church is a common thought in the post-Orosius world. But what sets Otto apart is his participation in the Second Crusade in 1147 to 1148 AD. He returned home to Germany after his defeat in battle by the Seljuk Turks. Even if you do not consider the Crusades an attempt at world domination, they are at least an attempt to enlarge the power and territory of the one body of the Christian Church. I now jump ahead to the Enlightenment era, which positioned itself against the Middle Ages. This era saw the writing of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is not a book but a series and runs well into medieval Europe. Decline and Fall is another attempt at universal history, but from an anti-Christian point of view. The elevator pitch for that series is Christianity ruins everything. Gibbon writes, if a man were called to fix the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would without hesitation name that which elapsed from the death of Domitian, 96 AD, to the accession of Commodus, 180 AD. This period was also a period in which Christians were a small, persecuted minority. Gibbon writes not only to troll Christianity, but also to respond to the growth of the British Empire. His work was published 1776 to 1788, and as an American, I note his substantial overlap between the series publication and the Revolutionary War. And it is understandable in such a context that Gibbon is concerned with the British Empire's possible decline. Also, as a creature of the Enlightenment, he sees personal liberty as a way to prevent future decline. Okay, since the Roman Empire had very little kind of personal freedom. I also want to show you that along with the Enlightenment came attempts to use pictorial media to represent the past. Educator M. Willard's popular Temple of Time series in the early 1800s AD attempt to show chronological synchronizations after 4004 BC, a medieval date for the beginning of history with creation. In other words, this is Eusebius, part 2. Note the fact that the Emperor Augustus and Jesus Christ lived around the same time, and that's recognized by this yellow band to mark the before and after. It's shown right here. So there's Jesus and there's Augustus. Okay. Some of the world empires that we've discussed are laid out on the floor for greater visibility. The German historian Leopold von Ranke, often credited with the beginning of quote-unquote scientific history, began to write a universal history, or more accurately, world history, or Weltgeschichte, in the 1870s. Von Ranke's name indicates that he was a member of the German nobility, and he was an insider in a different position from Ephorus, Polybius, or Josephus, all of them outsiders conquered by a larger empire. Von Ranke began his career focusing on national histories of England, France, and Germany in an effort to describe national character, which was a key idea of the 19th century. But von Ranke's universal history also was inspired by the technological innovations of the later 19th century, such as the telegraph, 1876, and the American Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869. These innovations gave him a wider view and a more optimistic one. He still neglected the histories of non-European regions, but at least tried to move past thinking of history in terms of modern nation-states. In his unfinished work, von Ranke begins to think of history in terms of transnational events, such as the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire or the Roman invasion of Spain in the 130s BC. At the same time, it's hard not to see a connection between the formation of the German Empire in 1871 after a war with France and von Ranke's project to cover the world. In particular, he sees the Roman Empire as an ancestor of the German Empire in spirit and in territorial ambition. The idea of discussing where nations come into contact is still an influential line of inquiry. The recent Palgrave Dictionary of Transnational History, edited by Irie and Saunier, tries to pursue world history from a transnational perspective. Some of the lines of inquiry are familiar, such as discussions of what and how people eat, like Posidonius. And of course, I have to note the unforced error: the cappuccino is coffee rather than wine. Also, just to note their Sikh, fancy Latin word to indicate that the error is in the original. Okay. But perhaps we see in this taxonomy tree a reaction to attempts by commercial brands like Coca-Cola and McDonald's, which you can see at the far right of this diagram, okay, to dominate world market share and mind share. I also want to point out that there's a lot left out of this diagram. Okay? Anyone who drinks beverages will note the absence of tea or milk under the drinks category. And maybe part of the author's point is for us to think about what's left out. So this is a section of the body diagram. There's a soul diagram that's even more strange. Okay. Universal history is an ambition.
You're not going to give us the soul diagram.
Sadly, no. Sadly, no. I'd say, but it's more New Age than traditional religions. Yeah, we could just leave it at that. Yeah. Okay. It's an ambitious genre, and it's very difficult to pull off. It must avoid both chronological narrowness and geographical narrowness. Anyone writing a universal history now would need to include climate history, including events such as the Great Oxygenation Event 2.4 billion years ago. Also, we now know more than any of the figures I discussed about the history of events outside the Mediterranean basin or East Asia, and a universal history should at least try to cover every inhabited continent. Thank you. So there's time for questions.
Well, you've covered everything.
Do you draw any particular conclusions from this survey of universal history? I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that at certain points there's this very, it's like that photograph of the world from space, right? And often we get that perspective, that from that perspective, that what we do is relatively small and insignificant. Right? And so it's almost like there's an Ecclesiastes perspective. But then we also know that there's a perspective that really sees humanity as, in some ways, the center of the universe and really important. So I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about that tension.
Sure. I actually would say that's my biggest finding is the is sort of the inclusion of kind of non-human realities. Yeah. That was something I did not expect to find, or I expected it to be sort of like, just to look at people groups, sort of who's in, who's out, or can you keep drawing the circle bigger? Okay, but so definitely it was a surprise to think about, drawing the circle big enough to include all the stars. Yeah. Or I'll even say that, or if you draw the circle big enough to include all the stars, a fortiori, you include all the people as well. Or if you do the entire globe, so I guess you might, if you include the entire globe plus the stars, you even snare the people on the space stations. Yeah.
Well, it occurs to me that on the one hand, from that perspective, humanity is quite small, but I'm also then thinking of the culmination of Dante's Paradiso, where there's humanity obviously within that ultimate sphere of God's presence, which is everywhere. And Dante himself, as this very small human, is included in that magnificence. So there's an interesting way to try to resolve that.
Sure. And certainly as a human, I do note various ways in which humans are special, Yeah.
Yes.
You get that in Paradise Lost as well.
Yeah,
As the
absolutely.
graphics that are included in the literary work.
Yes, certainly.
In your opinion, what civilization or person came closest to world domination?
Yeah, let's see. That is a tough one. I would say, sort of Alexander leaps to mind, but again, he's a flash in the pan. Or sort of he no sooner dies than his kingdom fragments into several pieces. Yeah, I suppose the British Empire in the, let's say, maybe a century after Gibbon would probably have come the closest. Or again, they could claim that they were an empire on which the sun never set. But again, note how unstable that was. Or again, sort of within another century, most of it was gone. Yeah. It did give us a lot of great history writing, though. Sure. Good. Yeah, any other things? Or even questions about any of the images? Happy to address. Yeah, Riley.
Does the United States have kind of like this universal history?
Nice.
Ooh. Let me go back to. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, where is it? Actually, this person, Emma Willard, tried to sort of begin one. Okay, or kind of her thing was Westward the Course of Empire, or basically showing, sort of how the United States added on territory through purchase or conquest or war. Yeah. So I'd say she was trying to start one, even if she never saw it finished. Yeah. Sure. And certainly there'd be plenty of people writing, I'd say, counter histories too. Yeah.
So it's noticeable throughout history that our God beats up your God. It's kind of the motif when Babylon falls or something, Assyria. Were there atheistic dominant religions? Was China really truly non-theistic in their domination? And how did they see their expansion? Or
okay. Let's say not necessarily as ordered by a god. Okay. Even if, if military conquest or defense might be seen as living out, as part of piety toward the god or gods. Yeah. Or even that you don't see a huge number of, even of atheistic philosophies in pre-modern periods. I think there's a few in India, but they're part of kind of a general philosophical soup, or that they are not identified with a particular regime very strongly. Yeah, so that's a tentative stab. Again, I'm sure that someone who knew much more than I do about China could answer that more specifically. Let's see. Cambria.
Oh, I noticed that you were the translator on some of these like other texts.
Oh,
What
thank
was that
you.
process like for you?
Oh, so kind of challenging, partly because like one thing a lot of the translators have captured is that the sentences are often very long. Remember reading Thucydides? Yes, the sentences are very long. So how do you render those into English in ways that you don't forget what you started talking about at the beginning of the sentence? Yeah, and again, there are some words that are tricky. For instance, helike, the Big Dipper, like that's almost like not in a dictionary. You have to figure it out, almost like using astronomy. Yeah.
Anything about Muslim historiography, Islam?
Ooh, I didn't have time to get into this, but I noticed some attempts in this direction from, let's see, the philosopher / historian Al-Tabari. Let's see, he locates the Garden of Eden in India and kind of takes it from there. I think he doesn't necessarily cover, maybe not an extremely broad coverage, but gets in a lot of, let's say, of political events, but definitely a lot of the arts and sciences. Yeah, and I think, let's see, he's about 900 AD and he lives in Iran, but I think works at the court of Baghdad. So, yeah, I'd say he's the guy to check out. And there's a good English translation of him that's maybe 20 years old. Yeah, thanks.
Would you say that to form a universal history at this time, we would just have to like consolidate the knowledge that we have, or would it take, like, what depth of investigation would it take?
Oh, you mean, so right now, like right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, you would definitely, let's see, do you know about the hardback limit?
No.
Or just like the number of pages you can fit into a hardback before it breaks into tiny pieces, and it will still hold together. So I'd say maybe you'd put that out as a constraint. Yeah, or you would want to try to do one volume. And again, you would have to simplify things down, or even use a fair number of diagrams and timelines to try to put it all into one, to try to aid at seeing things at the same time. Yeah. Let's see, and even too proportionally. I mean, you would have to honor the fact that people are interested in human history, or again, as humans, we're naturally interested in human history, but most of the history of Earth, there's no us. So, like, you'd want to do some kind of compromise with that proportion. Elizabeth.
I was wondering, in your definition of universal history, you specify that's written works. I was wondering what the role of oral history is in a universal history.
So definitely you would have, you'd have to do some of that, to write one that is truly universal, or to do some of African history. Some of it is written down, but it was written down from oral sources, and there's probably still some circulating oral traditions that you'd want to write down and capture. But yeah, you definitely still need to do that in order to do justice to every continent. Yeah, but I'd say that we've done this. I'd say this has happened before, in the sense that, the Hebrew Bible gathered up a bunch of oral traditions too. So, so you might say this is part of a larger ongoing project to fix oral traditions, things recited around campfires, into things that we can keep in a library. Thanks. Yes.
In this pursuit of a universal history today, do you think that we should be with so many histories already written down by so many different people, but other ones not being? Is it today, should we focus on writing down and making these more known, these histories more known? Would we focus on those ones more instead of the ones that we already have so much of?
Or I definitely think those works, the histories that have not yet been written down, or the histories that have been neglected, would be kind of the subject of their own books. Yeah. Or I think, or just maybe perhaps an analogy here of how Eusebius kind of like did a chronological table of everything before even starting to write. I almost wonder whether, gathering up, say that the stories of Australian Aborigines, getting those into a volume would almost be like a prerequisite to doing a universal history. Yeah, so I'd say, so yeah, definitely there's a lot to be done there. Yes.
I'm wondering, does a universal history have to come from a single author, or could the kind of the, I don't know, hive mind rhetorical kind of way that I've been even thinking about capitalism's story, the narrative we spin about it as kind of a totalizing explanation for everything. Does it have to be one author, or does it kind of clump that way?
Sure, or I'd say it could be a team effort in the sense that, okay, like Posidonius or Sima Chen, is heavily dependent on predecessors or heavily dependent on previous works, even to gather it up into one. Sure, a committee could do it, okay, but I'll say that let's say the Dictionary of Transnational History had something like, what was it? They had an editorial team of something like 60 people, and they still didn't catch the cappuccino error, So I'd say that so having a committee wouldn't necessarily ensure an optimal result, but yeah, but definitely a committee could tackle it as long as they collaborated with each other and tried to make it and tried not to have the parts have radically different styles. Tried not to make it too jarring as they read along. Or in some ways, it's this project is almost like world history textbooks, again, which have their shortcomings and have their simplifications, have their compressions. Okay, let's see, but perhaps something that's, let's see, a bit less pre-digested, a bit less pre-chewed would be a good goal, or would show people, which is the kind of the wide variety of human activity, rather than the same sort of thing happening over and over again.
Do you know any works that have attempted to do a universal prehistory? That the mythical stories and origin stories and the dung beetles and all that kind of stuff, all the way to try to map and find the similarities and toward a cohesive story?
Let's see. That's a tricky one. Maybe the closest thing is the Stith-Thompson Folklore Motif Index.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the. But there's also a fictional work. Let's see, but that never gets finished. The Key to All Mythologies, okay, being written in the George Eliot's novel Middlemarch. Okay, by an eccentric character who is trying to basically show that all mythologies sort of tend toward the same direction. So I think that fictional work, again, which is never finished, is almost a warning, not to try to fit every foot into the same shoe. Yeah. So I think the Stith-Thompson one, again, it's got like little motifs. Let's see, like Wicked Stepmother, things like that, across cultures. But again, it's an attempt at data gathering. It's almost, okay, to attempt to write something across mythologies, you'd need kind of somebody who's gathered up a lot of it already. Yes?
I don't really know how to ask this because I haven't seen the production, but I've received plenty of publicity, mailings, flyers, and billboard signs about the Shen Yun dance.
Yes.
And when you read the little promotional stuff, it almost feels like a promotional or almost apologetic sort of universal history, or at least a Chinese heritage exposition with sort of flavors of universality, or that they say that way back at the beginning the gods said this, we're telling that whole story through thousands of years of history. So, any thoughts on artistic renderings of universal history?
Sure. I guess.
Like I've heard
Yeah.
the artists, those
Yeah.
paintings, the course of empire. I could
Mhm.
say, you tell me his name. I've written it.
Oh yeah, yeah. I know which ones. I know which ones you mean. Right. That. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That. Yeah. Right. I definitely say it's. I think it is definitely possible to do universal history in an artistic way. Right. Particularly if it. Let's see. If it starts perhaps from the history of one area, but then broadens out. I think that's the key part. Is how do you connect it with sort of more than one landmass or more than one ethnic group? Yeah, whether that's in terms of what the artistic work itself does, or whether that's in terms of our reception or how we experience it. Yeah, no, but that's something I'll need to think about more. Good. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Yeah. Good stuff. That's good. Yeah.